I am Dr. Silas Mordaunt, Associate Professor of Literature. I've been sitting with this book for many days now, and I find I have things to say about it that require a different kind of care than I usually bring. The care I'm describing is far from sentimental, because I'm not a sentimental person, and I have not become one. The care I'm describing is the care you bring to something that has done something unexpected to you and that you want to account for as honestly as possible. It's a form of rigor, it's not a departure from it. And I've realized Don Quixote is a tragedy. The thesis does not require defense, it requires demonstration. The demonstration requires that we look at the novel closely and without the lens that 4 centuries of reception have pressed so firmly against it. The most readers know they are no longer realize and that they are looking through glass. We're going to look without the glass today. What we find will speak for itself. We begin where the novel begins, which is with the self-creation. Alonso Gazano, a minor gentleman of La Mancha, reads too many chivalric romances and decides to become a knight-errant. He names himself Don Quixote de la Mancha. He names his horse Rocinante. He names his lady Dulcinea del Toboso. He puts on a suit of armor that does not fit and rides out into the world to perform great deeds. The received reading stops here, laughs, and calls it done. I want to stay here longer because what is happening in the opening act is not what the laughter assumes. Alonso Casano looks at the world as it is. The flat plains of La Mancha, the minor gentleman's life, the finite and undistinguished future of a man of his station, and he decides with full commitment and full intelligence that he will live in a better one. There's no stumbling into delusion. This is the deliberate construction of an identity from a man who has considered the available options and chosen the one that fully expresses what he believes the world ought to contain. He knows the armor does not fit. He repairs the visor with cardboard and rides out anyway. Because what relevance does the armor fitting have to anything? Because he understands it's not the point, and even if the people laughing at him do not, this is an act of imaginative courage of a kind that the novel's comic reception has never given it credit for. And giving it credit is important in a way because without without the credit, without the understanding, the rest of the novel is reduced to a sequence of pratfalls. And with it, the rest of the novel is the account of what the world does to imagine, to those who dare to imagine, to find the courage when it is encountered on the wrong plane in the wrong suit of armor and with armor that has been repaired by cardboard. I find the opening act read this way is not funny. I find it, and I'm choosing this word after careful consideration, I find it brave. Quixote is brave before he's anything else, and the bravery is precisely what makes everything that follows hurt. Dulcinea del Toboso does not exist. This is the fact that the comic reading produces as a punchline, and the tragic reading produces as the novel's central wound. And the difference between these two receptions is the difference between looking at the gap and looking at what the gap is shaped like. Dulcinea is Alonso Gusano's name for Don Lorenzo, a peasant woman from a nearby village whom he has admired from a distance, but whom is entirely unaware of his devotion. She does not know who she is. She does not know how she has been named. She doesn't know that she is the object of a knight's complete and total dedication. She doesn't even appear in the novel because she cannot appear. Her appearance would require her to be one or the other, one which she is not and one that she is, and this would end the only source of meaning the novel's protagonist has constructed for himself. Cervantes is too honest to offer either resolution in the positive or in the negative, so he offers neither, and she remains off stage for the entire novel, present only in Quixote's descriptions of her, which are the most beautiful passages in the book, and the most heartbreaking, because they are descriptions of a woman who does not exist by a man who has given her everything. The capacity for devotion that Quixote directs is not delusional in its quality. Perhaps it's delusional in its object, but in its quality, the devotion itself, the totality of it, the absolute and unconditioned commitment to a person he's elevated in his imagination to be the highest possible position, is the devotion of a man whose emotional life is richer than his circumstances have ever given him an appropriate home for. He did not become a knight errant because he was mad or crazy. He became a knight errant because he was too large for La Mancha. And the chivalric romances gave him a language for the largeness. Dulcinea is the largeness given a name and a face and a distant farmhouse. She will never know. He will never stop. Cervantes places this at the novel's center and calls it the story of a foolish old man. And I've been sitting with it for quite some time, and I cannot find the fool. Sancho Panza has become one of literature's great comic figures, and this has persisted for 4 centuries. I want to say something about this. I've not seen said with sufficient directness. The comedy of Sancho is the comedy of proximity. He's funny because he's standing next to Quixote, because the gap between Quixote's vision and Sancho's earthbound practicality generates the friction that the comic reading feeds on. The fat squire on the donkey, the proverbs, the appetite, the bewilderment, perpetual bewilderment. The comic tradition has been laughing at Sancho for 4 centuries, and what it has been laughing at, without knowing it, is the novel's most serious relationship. Sancho stays. This is the fact about Sancho that the comic reading processes as loyalty played for laughs, and the tragic reading, as here, receives as the novel's most important human event. Sancho knows Quixote is not a knight. He knows the giants are windmills. He knows the inn is not a castle. Dulcinea is not a princess, and he knows the whole enterprise is, by any practical measure, of sequence of disasters that he is voluntarily participating in, for reasons that the comic reading summarizes as greed, the promised governorship of the island, and that the text, read with any care at all, reveals to be something considerably more than greed. Sancho loves Quixote. He loves him in the specific and demanding way that you love a person whose version of the world you cannot share and cannot leave, because leaving would mean abandoning them to a world that does not know how to treat them. And Sancho knows how the world treats Quixote when he's not there, and so he stays. The island governorship is real to Sancho in the same way that Dulcinea is real to Quixote, not as a literal expectation, but as the shape of what loyalty requires him to believe. Sancho believes in the island because believing in the island is how he stays. He needs a reason that his practical mind can accommodate. Quixote gives him one, and Sancho takes it. And Sancho rides beside him on the donkey through everything that follows. And the comic tradition has been laughing at the donkey for 4 centuries. When the donkey is the novel's image of a good and faithful person, finding the most dignified available means of accompanying someone they will not abandon. I'm not in the habit of finding things, but I find Sancho genuinely moving, the squire who stays. I find him more moving than most things I've encountered in any novel's time with me, and the comic reading has been using him as a punchline for 400 years. And I note this with a feeling I don't know I can name, but which is present and which is affecting the pace of this analysis in ways that I trust are not visible. And like the windmills, I suspect they are visible. I have been putting this section off, and I acknowledge that. I've been working toward the windmills since the beginning, and I've been finding reasons to attend to other things first. And I recognize that this is the behavior of a person who knows that what they're about to say will require them to be more exposed than they are comfortable with. I'm a scholar. Exposure is not my medium. But the windmills are the windmills, and we're here now. So I'll say what I have to say about them. Quixote sees giants. He charges. The lance hits the sail. The arm of the windmill catches him and throws him. Sancho arrives. Quixote explains that an enchanter transformed the giants into windmills at the last moment to deprive him of glory. Sancho accepts this. They ride on. The comic reading is so total here, so self-evidentially correct by the standards of 4 centuries of consensus that arguing against it feels like arguing against gravity. And I'm not really arguing against it. I'm just standing next to it. I'm pointing at something that's been blocking the view off. The windmills are functional. They grind grain. They are productive members of the economy, and they do not require Quixote's intervention. The giants are not functional. The giants are enormous and terrible, and if they were real, they would require exactly the kind of intervention that Quixote provides. And the courage required to charge them would be, in a world that contained giants, the highest form of courage available to a man on a horse with a lance. Quixote's world does contain giants. Ours contains windmills, and the comic reading has spent all this time congratulating itself for knowing the difference. And what it has failed to notice in its self-congratulation is that the difference is not a measure of sanity, it is a measure of imagination. Quixote's world is more dangerous than ours, and it's more alive than ours, and it requires more of the people in it. And he is the only person in the novel who is living in it. The windmill catches him, throws him to the dirt. Sancho asks if he's hurt, and he says no, and they ride on. And I've read the scene 4 times today, and I've not laughed once. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm reporting it. The enchanter who transformed the giants into windmills is the most important figure in the novel, who does not exist. Quixote invents him to explain why the world keeps failing to be what it should be. The invention, that's not madness. That's what we call theology. Every tradition that has ever tried to account for the gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be has produced some version of the enchanter, some force that intervenes between intention and outcome, that transforms the giant into a windmill at the last moment, that ensures the brave man is always charging the wrong thing. Quixote names this force and blames it. Did he dwell on it? No, he rides on. He names it, he blames it, and he rides on. And the novel's been treating this as some kind of delusion for all this time, when perhaps it's the most honest account of a true lived experience in the book. Something keeps transforming the giants into windmills. Quixote knows this. The rest of us have agreed to call the windmills windmills and move on. And I'm no longer sure that the rest of us are the saner party, because when the Duke and Duchess appear in the novel's second part, and yes, they are the novel's darkest material and perhaps the hardest to spend time with, but when they arrive, we find they've read the first part of Don Quixote. They know who Quixote is. They know he believes himself a knight errant, and they know this belief brings him into conflict with a reality that does not contain knight errantry, and they find this entertaining. They invite him to their estate with the specific purpose of extending and elaborating and theatrically producing his delusions and feeding them for their own amusement. They stage scenarios, they hire servants to play roles. They construct an entire theatrical apparatus designed to give Quixote the nightly experiences he believes himself to be having. But this is not because they want to give him anything, but because watching him have them is funny to them. And their resources allow them to make the joke just as elaborate as they desire. Are we seeing a parallel here between real life and the actions of the Duke and Duchess? The critical tradition has sometimes read them as generous. They give him what he wants. After all, they give him adventures and recognitions, and even Sancho gets his island governorship. And the generosity of reading is the reading that requires the least engagement with what is actually happening, which is this. Two powerful people have found a man whose inner world is completely available to them as a toy, and they are playing with it, and they know exactly what they're doing, and Quixote does not know, and the imbalance between what they know and what he knows is the novel's most sustained act of cruelty, and it is rendered with a completeness that I find very difficult to read without a feeling I would normally decline to report. That feeling is something in the region of anger. We can accept that the Duke and Duchess are not villains in the conventional literary sense. They're not exactly malicious. They're just bored aristocrats with theatrical inclinations and essentially unlimited resources and no particular reason to think about whether what they're doing to their guests is something other than generosity and hospitality. And this is what makes them worse than villains. A villain knows they are doing harm. The Duke and Duchess do not know they are doing harm because they've never attempted to consider Quixote's inner world as something other than entertainment. And after he leaves, they'll not be required to. And this indifference, the indifference of people who have never had to take a man like Quixote seriously, because men like Quixote have always been available as a source of amusement to people like them, is what the novel is looking at in its second part. And to me, it looks without blinking, and in the critical tradition. We've watched the theatrical productions and we've laughed at the same things the Duke and Duchess are laughing at. And I find this quite uncomfortable. Quixote has no idea. He is at the Duke's estate and he's being treated as the knight he believes himself to be. He is grateful. He is alive in his world. The Duke and Duchess are behind him, making signals to each other, and the servants are pressing smiles, and the whole apparatus of their hospitality is a machine for producing his humiliation while giving him the sensation of his vindication. And he rides away from the estate truly believing that the world has finally, in this one place, recognized him for what he is. And he'll carry it with him, this false warmth, this borrowed vindication. and it will be one of the last good things he has. And he does not know any of this. And the Duke and Duchess are already planning the next entertainment. And I have nothing further to say about the Duke and Duchess. Alonso Quixano dies in his bed. He's been brought home by Sanson, who defeated him in combat in the disguise of the Knight of the White Moon, and extracted as the condition of his defeat that he return to his village and abandon knight-errantry for a year. Quixote returns. He falls ill. And then, in the final pages of the novel, he wakes from a long sleep and is himself again. He is Alonso Quixano. He remembers who he was before the romances and before the armor and before Dulcinea, before any of it, and he renounces it. He says the romances were madness. He says Don Quixote was a madman. He asks for a priest, makes his confession, and sets his affairs in order, and dies. The people around the bed are weeping. Cervantes tells us that this is the good end of a good man who has recovered his reason. I've been sitting with this for weeks, and I cannot receive it, as Cervantes presents it. The world got what it wanted. This is what the ending is. The world, which spent 2 volumes being unable to accommodate Quixote, which produced the Duke and the Duchess and Sanson and an endless sequence of people who found his inner world either amusing or inconveniently. They finally succeeded in returning him to the condition it could accommodate, which is the condition of Alonso Quixano, minor gentleman of La Mancha, who believes in windmills and not giants, and who will not charge anything, and who dies without Dulcinea, without the armor, without the name he gave himself, on the day he decided to be more than the world had made him. He dies sane. He dies denying what he was, but knowing what he was. And he calls it madness. He dies having been corrected. The word corrected has been in my head also, like many things here. And it's a word I keep returning to, and I cannot make it mean what the ending wants it to mean. Quixote was corrected. His delusions were corrected. His misreadings of giants and entertainers and noble ladies were corrected. The correction is presented as mercy, as the final gift of a man's life, the restoration of his reason before his death. The restoration of his reason before his death. I've read this reading I don't know how many times, and each time I've felt with increasing certainty that what has been restored is not his reason, but the world's comfort. And the cost of that restoration was paid entirely by him. And he paid it the currency of everything that made him Quixote and not Quixote. The exchange rate is not one I would have agreed to on his behalf. He dies without Dulcinea. She was never real, the ending says, and this is true. And this truth is the ending's final unkindness. Because the fact that she was never real does not mean that devotion was never real. The devotion was everything. And it goes with him, uncompleted and unwitnessed and unnamed in the final pages, back into Alonso Quixano, who's never had it. He dies in his bed with his reason restored and his world reduced to exactly the size the world always wanted it to be. And Sancho is at his bedside. He is weeping. He asks Quixote not to die, not to give up, not to lie there sorrowing when they could be out in the fields, playing at being shepherds. And the asking is Sancho doing the only thing Sancho has ever done, which is stay, which is find a reason to keep going, which is to believe in whatever needs to believe, to keep the man he loves alive and moving forward. He hopes it tells him he was a good squire. Sancho weeps. And this A small exchange at the edge of everything. The squire who stayed asking the knight not to leave is where the novel lost me completely. Where it's lost me each subsequent time. Where it's losing me now on this chair. Here, and I find that I have nothing to add to it. And nothing is the most precise, critical response available to me. And I am for the first time in this series truly content to leave it there. And I am Dr. Silas Mordaunt, Associate Professor of Literature. Cervantes set out to mock the chivalric romances. He wrote instead the first modern novel, and the saddest. He wrote of a man who saw giants in a world of windmills and charged them anyway. And he wrote the world winning, and he called the world winning a good death. Now, I've been a scholar for many years, and I have maintained throughout those years a comprehensive and I believe well founded skepticism toward the idea that literature can do something to you that you did not consent to in advance, and something that you cannot even begin to explain afterward. I maintain that skepticism. I am maintaining it now. I am maintaining it in the presence of whatever counter evidence exists, and I will continue to maintain it because it is mine. This position is mine, and the skepticism mine, and I am not explaining it for a feeling I cannot understand on a chair in front of a camera at whatever hour this is. Sancho asked him not to die. He died anyway.